WoW has thousands of bosses from dungeons and raids, and today we're going to be taking a look at some of the more absurd encounters in the game. While most bosses are usually pretty serious and somber and usually have their own complicated lore associated with them, occasionally one does run into some bosses where the devs just had some fun. Many bosses have pretty funny unique dialogues, but we'll be focused on bosses with silly mechanics or gimmicks. So bosses that include the likes of the magical mayhem of the Manastorms are unfortunately not going to be included on the list, since their antics are mostly dialogue rather than actual gameplay. Starting off this list at number 10 is Mistcaller. This is the second boss of the Mist of the Tyrant dungeon from the Shadowlands expansion. After navigating an infamous maze of mists and trees, the brave heroes of Azeroth must face a very dangerous foe, which is a little tricksy fairy. Right before the fight, Mistcaller makes players wander through a labyrinth to the deep heart of the Mistfell Tangle. Mistcall has two fun little mechanics. In the form of a dodgeball she'll throw at a player, and she'll also replicate herself in a guessing game. Most players find this boss incredibly annoying, especially the disoriented maze before her encounter, which will teleport players back to the start of the arena if they choose the wrong route. Mistcaller is a somewhat deconstructed trope of a corrupted guardian, as she's not truly evil, but rather is just confused, at least according to the adventure guide. There are many bosses in WoW that fill the archetypal role of the protector that must be defeated for the heroes to prove their worth and proceed onward. But Mistcaller is unique in this category of bosses because her fight is lighthearted and fun, even if it is annoying. Compare her to, say, General Nazgrim in the Siege of Orgrimmar for a fun contrast. Mistcaller is for sure there to lighten the mood of the dungeon, and a fairy is a perfect thematic match for the Celtic inspiration of Ardenwald. But she is just so dang annoying that she gets the lowest spot on this list. In fact, even the devs probably realize how much of a pain Mistcaller is, as the Mist of Tyrant dungeon is one of the few in the entire game to only feature 3 boss encounters instead of the usual 4 or 5. Up next, number 9, we have Operator Thorgar from the Blackrock Foundry raid. This boss is the big orc dude that commands the rail yard for the Iron Horde on an alternate Draenor, where he serves as the second boss in the Iron Assembly wing of the raid. This boss is pretty silly in a number of ways, but the biggest mechanic of the fight is that the players are engaging the boss on several open railway tracks with trains coming in and out at all times at random intervals. Failing to get out of the way of a train instantly kills the player, just as it very much would in real life. This premise is a fun gimmick for a boss fight, but even the stupidest of Azeroth's heroes should probably have realized that the fight on an open railway with trains flying in is not the smartest decision. To both sell the stage set of the fight, as well as adding in a fun cute little detail, the devs made it so that Operator Thorgar does yell actual railway yard commands and jargon. While there are many boss encounters in WoW where the environment itself factors into the mechanics of a fight, Operator Thorgar certainly takes the cake as being one of the most unique, fun, and just silly. As a final note of silliness, there is a very fun achievement called There's Always a Bigger Train, associated with the boss. The achievement's description is all that is needed. Engineer the iconic demise of an exulting wind-up train wrecker in Blackrock Foundry on normal difficulty or higher. Presumably, this is a reference to the Phantom Menace, in which the Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn at one point says there's always a bigger fish, which could invite many cheeky meta comparisons between the sequel prequels of both the World of Draenor expansion and the Star Wars sequel prequel movies, if you think too much about it. And at number 8, we have Siegecrafter Blackfuse from the Siege of Orgrimmar. The chief of the Blackfuse company and the chief engineer of the True Horde gives players a willy and witty fight that makes good use of some good old goblin engineering. The beginning of this counter starts when players enter the massive underground room and see the first appearance of the Iron Star, with Blackfuse being pretty mad about the players having killed his baby, the Iron Juggernaut, outside the gates of Orgrimmar. Moria and Gizzle Gearslip are there, but also don't really do anything, which is a shame. To access the boss platform, we have to kill a plethora of additional adds that spawn during the fight. Players must ascend and descend tubes and piping into and out of the main siege area. Here, surrounded by conveyor belts and crazy assembly lines, the players convene on Blackfuse as he unveils his Shredder mech suit, which, while there are many fights in WoW where the boss fight spans multiple arenas as a new phase begins, only during the Siegecrafter Blackfuse fight are players treated to Mario levels of tomfoolery, jumping and zipping in and out of tubes as mines explode, saw blades buzz, and lasers do their laser thing. Siegecrafter Blackfuse certainly celebrates the ingenuity and zaniness of goblin engineering, and it really shows in the encounter. The devs obviously had a fun time designing this boss fight, and it's somewhat of a shame that Siegecrafter Blackfuse often gets overlooked just because there are so many other good bosses in the Siege of Orgrimmar raid. The sheer inventiveness and absurdity of the Blackfuse is a mixed bag as a whole, but the comedic overtones of the fight are not so easily overlooked, and combined with some banger one-liners from the boss, add up to make this raid pretty absurd and downright silly. And at number 7, we have the chess event from Karazhan. This notorious encounter is the penultimate fight in the iconic raid in the Burning Crusade expansion. Players take control of giant chess pieces and command them across a life-size chessboard. The player's opponent is none other than Medivh, and to win the encounter and grab the loot, you must defeat him in a chess match. However, all is not simple. As it seems, since Medivh is prone to cheating, there's also a debuff preventing the player from jumping onto another piece immediately after dismounting one. While the encounter can be soloed, it does take a specific strategy to win. Each piece possesses unique abilities and movement patterns that correspond to its chess piece in the real world, and this requires players to carefully plan their moves and adapt their strategies accordingly. All the chess pieces are represented as the Horde and the Alliance, and are thematically modeled and named after units in the First War. For example, the bishop piece for the Alliance is a human cleric, and the equivalent to the Horde side is an orc necrolyte. King Lane serves as the Alliance king, and Blackhand serves as the Horde king. Fighting a life-size chess piece is a bit silly, especially after adventurers have slaughtered their way all the way up to the top of the tower in Karazhan. The Return to Karazhan dungeon in Legion has a literal new twist to the chess room, where the checkboard spirals. The chess event was removed because it was such a hassle and was replaced with just a group of trash. It also is likely that this entire chess event is a reference to the penultimate trial to obtain the Sorcerer's Stone or Philosopher's Stone in the first Harry Potter book, which was also featured in the first movie. And at number 6, we have the Council of Dreams from the Amidrisol raid, which is the last raid of the Dragonflight expansion. The fight consists of a 3-boss encounter with the bear boy Urktos and the dryad Eren and the mischievous fairy Pip. While there are many examples of the 3 bosses sharing health pools throughout the history of WoW, with one such example being the Entoran High Command and the Council of Dreams, it's unique in the fact that each of these 3 bosses' mechanics overlap with one another and affect the other bosses. These mechanics must be used properly to interrupt the cast of the major abilities by one of the bosses, which draws some chagrin from the boss who was interrupted. Specifically, Urktos' barreling charge ability stops Erwin's constricting thicket, and Pip's polymorph bomb ability cancels Urktos' blind rage buff. If these casts are allowed to go off, usually the entire raid will wipe. When one boss cast interrupts the other, there's also some funny and quippy dialogue, which is always a plus. The canceling of each other's boss's abilities is a fun and cute little gimmick, with the encounter also being rather silly in a number of other ways. While supposed to be the somber guardians, the Council of Dreams is a little wacky, and the only somewhat non-serious boss in the Amidrisol raid. The most important part of this fight is that players are turned into ducks and can quack. The chaotic, fun, silly energy behind the Council of Dream fights was actually the main inspiration for this video, so of course it ends up appearing in this list. It's a shame that players must kill the Council and not simply DPS them to low health and have the Council deem them worthy to pass, because these 3 bosses have some of the best chemistry since Rathsquire Socrates and Delia the Doomsayer from the Burning Crusade dungeon, the Arcatraz. And at number 5, we have the Echo of Dagosa from the Algothar's Academy dungeon added in Dragonflight. The final boss is a magical projection of the headmistress of the academy that's a bit too enthusiastic about teaching the perceived bad players turned students a lesson in discipline. As the battle commences, players quickly realize that the Echo is no ordinary adversary. Her arcane powers are vast, and she possesses an arsenal of devastating spells at her disposal. However, all of her abilities are school-themed, and she delivers some great puns. For example, when she marks a player with a debuff, she howls,
"Poor marks for poor students!"
And when she does a knockback, she says,
"Go to the corner!"
This is a funny contrast to the actual sweet and old head teacher Dagosa. When players defeat her, the projection that's guarding the academy, she has a really cute bit of dialogue and says,
"Oh dear. It seems the parameters I wove into my out-of-office spell were a bit, extreme. Thank you for all your help in getting the school ready."
Algothar Academy as an entire dungeon is pretty goofy and lighthearted. And another boss in the instance called Kroth almost made onto this list with a silly talon toss ball mechanic. Algothar Academy is a place where players can expect to encounter strange and unusual challenges, as well as interact with a variety of quirky, memorable characters. The overall tone of the dungeon is one of fun and adventure, and it's clear the developers had a lot of fun creating it. This silly boss fight of awesome and awfully angry administrators of Algothar Academy is actually adorable, but also absurd, which is why it comes in halfway at this list at number 5. In a drastic shift of tone, we turn our attention to Warcraft Manor. This spooky, haunted house infected with witches and Drust is home to Ral the Gluttonous, who comes in at number 4 on this list of our silly boss fights video. Warcraft Manor is one of the most dark and dour dungeons in the entirety of WoW, which is actually quite impressive. It has an oppressive atmosphere and is perfectly at home in the northern parts of the zone of Drustvar, added in the Battle for Azeroth expansion. However, Blizz being Blizz decided to add some levity to the dungeon with Ral the Gluttonous. According to the adventure guide, Ral was once the head chef of Warcraft Manor until dark magic turned him into a beastman with a pig head, who served meals akin to that of Frey pie. Ral can be found behind the massive dining room table, having gorged himself to a fat abomination. Despite his disturbing appearance, this fight is actually quite fun and a little goofy. Ral's biggest AoE attack is called Tenderize, which is an obvious food preparation pun, assuming it's not meant to be taken literally. Ral also calls ads, which are servants carrying rotten food, and has a host of one-liners that'll make you sick to your stomach. There's just something so goofy about being in a literal food fight with a giant fat pig man. Although meant to be very dark, it ends up looking very silly, and was probably just a passing reference to a boss from the game Darkest Dungeons. The cannibalism featured is dark and twisted for sure, but when Ral yells,
"Tonight's menu will be extra tasty."
when a player dies, it is both very dark and very silly. The fact that the fight is actually both very morbid while also being comedic is quite an impressive feat in and of itself. Ral himself is certainly a feast for the eyes, and the art of the model team deserves an immense amount of credit for the boss, who is among the most disturbing looking bosses in the entire game, even up there with Yogg-Saron's giant mouth. And speaking of Yogg-Saron, we now turn our attention to Ulduar, which is home to our number 3 spot. Mimon is one of the goofiest and fun fights in the entire game by nearly any metric imaginable. This giant metal gnomish Titan Keeper is a great inventor, and to get to his boss room, players have to take an underground train in Ulduar. What follows is one of the most memorable boss fights in the entire game, as Mimon assaults the players using various deadly vehicles that he's invented. There are 4 phases to his fight, with Mimon changing his vehicles between each phase. The first phase has him hop into a large tank named the Leviathan MK2, which hosts a deadly array of mines, shock blasts, napalm rounds, and plasma guns. The second vehicle during the second phase is a large laser weapon named VX-001. The third phase is a cute little flying helicopter named the Aerial Command Unit, which provides Mimon with some not-so-cute and friendly assault bots and bomb bots. In the fourth phase, the 3 vehicles combine into a mech suit cleverly named V07TR0N. This is an obvious pun on Voltron, the 80s animated series in which a team of space explorers pilot a giant super robot named as Voltron. The fourth phase combines all these mechanics together, meaning players must avoid mines, bombs, aerial strikes, laser guns, and a whole host of other fun and quirky abilities. To activate the hard mode version of the boss, players can push a big red button that says "Do Not Push," which starts a self-destruction sequence which serves as a 10-minute timer before the room is destroyed and all the players are killed. Mimon's fight is a testament to Blizzard's ability to weave humor, creativity, and challenging mechanics into a single exhilarating experience. Mimon's encounter is not just a battle, it's a delightful blend of wit, intellect, and adrenaline. And while you're running Ulduar, don't forget that Yogg-Saron can drop the much desired Mimon's head mount, but remember that it requires for all the Watchers to be deactivated for it to be able to be dropped. And at number 2, we have the fan favorite, Trilliax. This insane Nightborn construct janitor underneath the Nighthold is certainly something completely different from that of a regular fight. Trilliax serves as a third encounter in the second raid of the Legion expansion, which is the Nighthold. Once a steward of Suramar in the Nighthold, this arcane construct was abandoned to the depths of the sewers below the city of the Nightborn, where he slowly went insane. Players must put him out of his misery, and he seems to have developed a Smeagol Golem split personality disorder, where sometimes he's a well-behaved, gentlemanly butler, and other times a maniacal janitor intent on mopping the floors with blood. This is best observed in one of the great quotes,
So good to see you, Master. How may I serve you?
Not only is this premise and gimmick a great starting point for the fight, but the mechanics are good too. The fight allows players to literally have their cake and eat it too, as Trilliax will spawn poisonous cakes as refreshments that must be eaten and absorbed. Eating these cakes gives the players a fun slow debuff called Stuffed, which is a great little detail. Another fun ability is when Trilliax calls in his army magical Roombas after the floor of the boss room has gotten dirty. Overall, Trilliax is a great fight, and it would be quite unbecoming not to include it high on this list, or else it would be considered
Filthy, filthy, filthy!
And at number 1, we have an entire dungeon. The Stout Brewery dungeon from the Mist of Pandaria expansion is unlike any other in the entire game, and we really mean it this time. This dungeon consists of 3 bosses, Ukuk, Hoptalis, and Yonzo the Uncast. All 3 of these bosses were going to appear on this list, and instead of having 3 separate entries for each of them, we just compiled them all into one spot, given that they're all in the same dungeon, and otherwise they would take up nearly a third of the entries. The Stout Brewery dungeon is simply absurd. There's no way around it. The lore behind it is pretty simple. It is the ancestral home of the Stormstouts, and the players accompany Chen Stormstout as he visits the place and is appalled when he's seen it overrun by Hosen and vermin. To help accomplish the lofty goal of preserving Chen's legacy and his beer, the intrepid heroes of Azeroth must fight a band of frat monkeys, a giant carrot-eating rabbit, and an elemental made of beer. Now, granted, a bit of levity isn't bad and something Blizzard has never backed away from. In fact, the Stout Brewery was the 3rd dungeon announced when MoP was being developed, which showcases how dark the story was going with a genocidal war chief that the team felt it enough to warrant such a light-hearted dungeon to the counterbalance of the somber tone of the story and the lore, which was surrounding much of the upcoming expansion. And while Chen has been somewhat of a meme character, his stop at the Stout Brewery is a logical one during his wacky adventures with Lily across Pandaria. However, Stout Brewery is the only dungeon in the entire game which doesn't take itself seriously at all. Usually, Blizz will have fun bosses every now and again, but not a whole dungeon full of them. And to Blizzard's credit, they have never made a completely meme dungeon since Stout Brewery, and were cognizant enough to make the dungeon only have 3 bosses instead of the usual 4 in most other MoP dungeons. With all the exposition context aside, let's discuss the actual bosses of the instance. The first boss is named Ukuk, a rowdy hosen who rules over the rambunctious Ukapalooza festival. The most memorable part of this boss fight, aside from an army of drunk hosen, is that players have to dodge and or take control of rolling barrels and brew throughout the fight. Players can mount the barrels by clicking on it, which allows their character to walk precariously and allows for the player to control the rolling barrel that they're on top of. Running and ramming a barrel rolling on its side into an Ukuk gives the giant hosen monkey ability a whack and increases the damage taken by 10%. Ukuk isn't regarded among the best fights in the history of the game, but rolling barrels into a boss to debuff him is a bit silly, and this gimmick is really the entirety of the fight, more or less. There's also a fun achievement called Keep Rollin' Rollin' Rollin', and to get it, players must assault Ukuk with 20 rolling barrels. Upon defeating Ukuk, players are crowned the new boss of the party, so that's an added benefit. The second boss of the Stout Brewery dungeon is Hoptalis. This boss is a giant rabbit-like vermin with an equally ravenous appetite. This is just another silly boss, and the names of the abilities being called Carrot Breath and Whirlwind is a bit hard to take too seriously. Players can also loot giant wooden hammers, which come in useful when dealing with the hordes of smaller vermins with cartoon-like efficiency. The wooden hammers, called Big Ol' Hammers, knock back and stun the ads during the fight and in the hallway leading up to the encounter. If players can get the angle right, they may even be able to line up a vermin to get the achievement, How Did He Get Up There? This achievement requires players to hit a vermin like a golf ball up into the rafters. However, the most insulting part of the fight is when Hoptalis dies and he says that players have turnips for heads. Stout Brewery might be lighthearted, but this is just going too far. The third and final boss of the brewery is Yonzo the Uncask. This is an elemental made out of beer. So of course Blizzard decided to call him an ale-elemental. He is created when Uncle Gao mixes a wide variety of ingredients and creates something he really shouldn't have. After defeating waves of smaller elementals, Yonzo finally emerges. The fight with Yonzo is somewhat of a doozy, literally. There are multiple fun and silly mechanics throughout the fight, most of which are beer themed. These are largely divided into 3 schools of mechanics and are called brew masteries, depending on what Uncle Gao cooks up. The first brew mastery is wheat. This inflicts a dot on a player called bloat, and it allows Yonzo to periodically apply the blackout brew debuff to players. If blackout brew reaches 10 stacks, the brew stuns the player for 10 seconds. The debuff can only be removed by moving and jumping. The second brew mastery is called ale and grants Yonzo a bubble shield and the ability to summon ads. These ads are called yeasty brew elementals, which do damage and also have a healing ability called ferment, which restores 1% health and 1% mana per second to the boss. Players can also stand in the stream to gain the buff instead, but it's wiser to just quickly kill them since multiple can spawn and start healing the boss. The final mechanic comes from the brewmastery Stout. Yonzo can cast the carbonation ability, which turns the floor into poisonous and asphyxiates and silences players. He also spawns fizzy bubbles, which players must click and float in. Players can then fly around the room in their bubbles above the floor and avoid taking the damage. However, unlike the movie Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the flying buff ends after 20 seconds instead of having the player burp to release the gas and fall down. The other ability invoked by Brewmastery Stout is called Wall of Suds. This does exactly as it sounds like and summons a wall of moving bubbles, and if players don't move out of the way, it will stun them for 5 seconds. Players must jump over this hurdle by just jumping extra high with the Sudsy buff, which essentially is like a pair of rocket shoes. All of this combines so that during the final fight of the Stout Brewery, players are getting drunk while flying bubbles and bouncing around. The fight clearly takes the cake, or rather the ale, for our #1 spot. Yonzo is definitely the most fun and interesting out of all the boss fights in the Stout Brewery, but we'd be remiss if we did not include Ukuk and Hoptalis as well. Stout Brewery feels like a true brewery with a lively and chaotic atmosphere, and thanks to the incredible art and design team, it really feels like you're in the middle of a real brewery. Not all dungeons have to be so grim and dark, and while certainly it has never shied away from comedy and humor, Stout Brewery also skillfully creates the sense of adventure and unpredictability that are what makes dungeons so captivating in the first place. It certainly embodies the pure unrestrained fun chaos of a dungeon, and even if it is a bit too self-indulgent in its absurdity at points, the dungeon sure does invoke warm and fuzzy feelings. Whether we are love drunk with the dungeon or just have a very bad inebriated take can be debated, but we raise our drinks to the Storms Out Brewery, and whose final boss Yonzo, the Uncast, is probably the craziest and silly fight in the entire game. To conclude the video, we'll list some honorable mentions. WoW has some 1,200 plus bosses in it, with more being added every major update. So of course it was hard to decide which bosses to put here, and there will no doubt be some disagreements with the video. So here are the honorable mentions. Swamp Lord Muslik in the Underbog, who has somehow managed to tame a druid as his pet bear. Hegan the Unclean in Nax and his safety dance, the Dance Macabre of the Council of Blood in the Council Nathria, and of course the plays in the Opera Hall in Karazhan. As always, thanks for watching, and do the YouTube things everyone tells you to do. Leave your questions, comments, and suggestions for new videos down below, and stay silly, my friends.